Welcome everybody to our next forum, called Up Front with Willie and Joe. I just want to let you know that when I found out that the reunion was going to be in Pittsburgh this year, I called Betty Root, who's down here, and I said, Betty, what are we supposed to do in Pittsburgh when we get there? So she gave me several suggestions. And actually, she put me in touch with Senator Pippy, who will be our keynote speaker tomorrow night. And then she told me about this wonderful speaker that she'd heard numerous times, who knows the story and shares the story and writes the story of Willie and Joe. And this is Todd Depastino. And before he begins, I'd like to, if you don't mind my reading it, I'd like to read you some information about him. Todd Depastino is the officer of Bill Mauldin, A Life Up Front, which won the 2009 Anne Sperber Prize for Biography and was named one of the best books of 2008 by the Boston Globe, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, among others. Todd is also editor of the acclaimed Willie and Joe, The World War II Years, the first complete collection of Bill Mauldin's World War II cartoons. He's currently writing and co-producing a documentary film about Mauldin to be aired on public television, and I hope you'll be filling us in on that more today. His previous books include Citizen Hobo, How a Century of Homelessness Shaped America. It won a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Todd has a PhD in American History from Yale University, and he teaches at Waynesburg University, where he won the Lucas Hathaway Award for Teaching Excellence in 2008, and he lives here in Pittsburgh with his two daughters. Todd has brought several books, which I'm sure you're able to purchase from him when this is over. So for now, I'll just turn you over to Todd and look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and Karen and Betty for asking me to come and speak here today. This will be Betty's, at least her third time through this talk, so it must be good. And it truly is an honor. It just warms my heart to see so many World War II veterans and their families together, and to give a talk to the 87th Division Association. It's always nice to give this talk to people who know who Bill Mauldin was. Behind me is an image of a stamp. Too loud? Okay. When one of you guys says back off, I back off. It's always good to give a talk somewhere where people know who Bill Mauldin was. Behind me is a replica of a stamp that was issued on March 31st of this year, and I had a very small role in consulting on it, and I was able to go to the first day of issue ceremony in Santa Fe, New Mexico on March 31st, and I walked into the hotel, and I checked in, and a woman about my age was at the desk, and she said, "What are you in town? Welcome to Santa Fe. What are you in town for?" And I said, "I'm here for the first day of issue, Bill Mauldin stamp." And she said, "Great. Who is Bill Mauldin?" And it's a question I'm used to. And I did tell her that, it's okay. I really didn't know who Bill Mauldin was until about a year before I started working on his biography. To me, Bill Mauldin was a name that appeared every November 11 in Peanuts. Every Veterans Day, Charles Schulz put Snoopy in his World War I Flying Ace outfit, and there was World War II garrison cap, and Snoopy would go out and quaff a few root beers at Bill Mauldin. And that was about the extent of it. By the way, every year, Schulz would sign the original drawing with a note and send it to Mauldin. And Mauldin was quite appreciative of this. He said, "You finally made me respectable to my children." So for 30 years, Schulz did this cartoon. This is one of the last ones he did. Schultz did 18,000 cartoons over a 50-year career. Never had anybody assist him in inking letters or anything. The only cartoon where somebody else's work appears is this one, from November 11th, 1998. Willie and Joe say, "I think the new replacements are getting smaller all the time." And Snoopy says, "Willie and Joe, my heroes. Happy Veterans Day, man." And it's signed by Schultz and my hero, Bill Mauldin. I knew of the name from the Schultz cartoons, but I didn't really know who he was, and I still didn't know who he was when I was finishing up my first book, which was A History of Homelessness in America. And that book really traces a huge subculture in this country that crisscrossed the country on rails between roughly the end of the Civil War and World War II. And I said to several people as I was finishing up that book that hobos just disappear with World War II. And a combat veteran relative of mine from Europe said, "Hobos didn't disappear, they got drafted." I served with them. Willie and Joe are hobos in olive drab. And he told me to go and get this book up front, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 19 weeks in the summer of 1945. And I got it out and I read it. And I read it in one sitting, which is not too hard to do. 162 cartoons, about 30,000 words. But I was stunned, I was absolutely absorbed by it, because it presented the war in a way that I had never seen it presented from the time. You know, I mean, it was a censorship kind of screened Americans from the realities of combat during World War II. It was a sanitized visual environment, you know, where our fighting men were always brave, morale was always high, and we were winning every battle. But in Mauldin's war, and up front, you know, men pressed themselves into the ground when under fire. "I can't get no lower, Willie, my buttons are in the way." In Bill Mauldin's war, men spent most of the time just exhausted, just a struggle to maintain consciousness. Willie and Joe wished I could stand up and get some sleep. Schultz always said that Mauldin was the greatest cartoonist who ever lived. And people would ask him why. And one year, he had Snoopy give the answer. Because he drew great mud. I didn't know before reading this book that it was possible to fall asleep while marching. I didn't know that it was possible. It's been done a lot, I've since found out. And it was quite a common experience. Not a deep sleep, but you do sleep. Maybe Joe needs a rest. He's talking in his sleep. I didn't know that combat veterans in Italy, at least in 1943 and 1944, spent most of their time hungry because they weren't getting their rations. Because in Italy, their rations were being stolen and sold on the black market. Many of his cartoons deal with this issue of food. Here's Willie and Joe with the smoking machine gun. "I could have swore a couple of Krauts was using that cow for cover, Joe. Go wake up the cooks." They didn't have proper clothing. I was just talking to a couple of vets a few minutes ago who said that they didn't have the right boots for the Battle of the Bulge. Many of you remember that, I'm sure. And it was the same situation in Italy. Here's Willie and Joe with the German POW. "Get his pistol, Joe. I know where we could swap it for a combat jacket and some boots." A lot of these cartoons had backstories that I was not familiar with at all. Like this one. This one took some time to learn about. Paratroopers, as you remember, took great pride in their high-laced jump boots. And the problem in Italy was that every pair was stolen and sold on the black market. If you were a paratrooper and you wanted those boots, you had to pay $100 a pair for them. The only people who bought them in Italy were officers. Mauldin, a three-stripe sergeant, was given a pair as a gift. He said he wore them around for about a day and a half, and so many mean-looking paratroopers grabbed him by the lapels on the street and said, "Where the hell did you get those boots?" That he put them away, and he did this cartoon. Two officers walking down the street with those mean-looking paratroopers leaning against a lamppost. It's best not to speak to paratroopers about saluting. They always ask you where you got your boots. You know, in Bill Mauldin's war, officers often acted with indifference, ignorance, arrogance. I never knew what a gap there was in World War II between the officer corps and the enlisted men. Much, bigger gap than exists today. And Mauldin, of course, cartooned about this all the time. Sir, do you have to draw fire while you're inspiring us?
I would say, though, the gap was between above company level.
Above company level with the officers who didn't, and you'll notice in several of these cartoons that Mauldin includes company level officers with Willie and Joe. They're kind of sharing in the misery of Willie and Joe. Beautiful view. Is there one for the enlisted men? I didn't know that combat soldiers at the time really weren't very interested in medals and ribbons and awards. Mauldin drew this cartoon after he was wounded in the mountains around Monte Cassino in 1943. Just give me the aspirin. I already got a Purple Heart. I finished this book and sat down and started it again. And upon the second reading, I detected something that I really didn't detect the first time around, and that is the tragic undertone to all these cartoons. There's a sadness to Willie and Joe that I think comes from the experience of being exposed too much too young, to too much death and pain and hardship. And I think about this when I see this cartoon of Joe looking down at his rifle. I've given you the best years of my life. And I thought about this cartoon actually when I was learning about Mauldin, because it just so happened that same summer of 2002, Mauldin was in the news again because he was dying. He was in a nursing home in California. And I would later learn about how kind of sad and sordid his demise was. He was an alcoholic, drinking about a quart of vodka a day. He had early onset Alzheimer's. He had scalded himself in a bathtub, 3rd-degree burns from his neck to his knees, and he would die of those injuries. He didn't recognize friends or family. But one veteran from 42nd Division, a guy named Jay Grunfeld, I've become friends with him since, he heard that Mauldin was ailing and paid him a visit and spent hours with him, talking with him, sharing memorabilia. And at the end of the meeting, he pinned a combat infantry badge on Mauldin's pajamas. And Mauldin looked down at it, looked up at Jay, and a big smile beamed on his face. And Jay said, "Bill, do you want me to come back?" And Bill said the first word he had spoken in weeks, "Yes." And Jay went around to VFWs and American Legions, gathered up all the World War II vets he could, and paraded them into the nursing home. They came about a dozen a day. They waited their turn to sit down with Mauldin and share time with him. Bob Green, a syndicated columnist, wrote about this remarkable event and invited Americans around the country to send their thank you to Bill Mauldin, and the letters came by the sackful. 10,000 cards and letters came to Mauldin by the time he died in January 2003. So many that the family couldn't even open them all and read them. So eventually they put them in a box and shipped them to me, and I opened them and I read them. And they're some of the most moving things I've ever read. Many of them included clippings of this cartoon, and I know that your 87th Division cartoonist did a version of this that's hanging up on the wall over there. It's one of the favorites of veterans of the Italian campaign who suffered from trench foot, right? And this one vet in particular wrote a wonderful letter. He said, "I will always remember this cartoon because I felt like you were explaining to people what it was like, what we were going through. People didn't understand what trench foot meant. That what happened when your feet were submerged in water for days or weeks at a time." And this wonderful cartoon is Willie with his hand around Joe. And he said, "Joe, yesterday you saved my life and I swore I'd pay you back. Here's my last pair of dry socks." And this one vet who wrote him a card included a pair of Army-issue socks for Bill. And the family made sure that those socks were in his casket when Bill was buried in January 2003. There's one other letter I'd like to mention just because it sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. It was written by a woman, a war widow, whose husband was killed in 1944. And she said, "Before my husband was killed, he wrote me letters, and with those letters he enclosed clippings of your cartoons. And I didn't understand the cartoons at the time because we weren't receiving them on the home front. But in the years that passed, I've got to understand what those cartoons meant and what they must have meant to my husband. And I'm writing now just to thank you for buoying his spirits before he was killed." How fresh her grief, after 60 years. And how intimately connected Bill Mauldin was to her grief And I think it was upon reading that letter that it hit me, or I came to understand what Bill Mauldin means to the World War II generation. He was a bearer of grief. But if you look at this photograph, you get the sense that he was not born to be a bearer of grief. He was born to be an imp, which he was. He remembers a teacher saying to him when he was about 8 or 9 years old, "Mauldin, you're a troublemaker. And if you can figure out a way to make a living at it, you'll be a millionaire." He was sickly. He had rickets as a child. He was underweight, weak. He was born on a farm and couldn't do the simplest farm chores. And his parents were bewildered with him because he was also a genius. He was reading novels at age 4. He was doing long division at age 5 or 6. He was drawing elaborate drawings at age 4 and 5. He could master any academic task you gave him. But where he came from, in the mountains of southern New Mexico, such intellectual prowess wasn't valued at all. Bill had an older brother, Sid, older by 1 year. Sid was the promising one of the family. Sid was 6 feet tall by age 15. Sid weighed 50 pounds more and looked like Gary Cooper. Sid could take apart a tractor engine and put it back together blindfolded. And nobody cared that Sid was illiterate, and he was his whole life. Bill was considered the failure of the family. Bill remembers walking past a bench in front of a general store, and 2 ranchers were sitting next to each other. And as Bill walked past, the one rancher leaned over to the other and said, "If that was my kid, I'd drown him." Never forgot that grievance. To say that he came from a dysfunctional family is an understatement. His father was a professional hell raiser. He was actually a part Cherokee Apache Indian. His mother was was emotionally unstable, and so at age 14, in 1936, Bill decides it's time for him to leave home, start out on his own, which was not unusual in the Great Depression. Bill and his brother, age 15, pulled an old Model T Ford from the family junk pile, drove it as far as they could, which was Phoenix, Arizona, and they started a new life there. They lived on the front porch of a boarding house, attended school sometime, neither graduated. Bill painted signs. He had a great moneymaker the summer of 1936. He painted news on canvas tire covers. So every hot rodder in Phoenix had a Mauldin nude. And finally the police caught up with him because it broke an obscenity ordinance and made him paint some swimsuits on those nudes. He was a high school dropout who found himself an unemployed sign painter in 1940, and he joined the Arizona National Guard 4 days before it was federalized and made part of the United States Army. If he had waited 4 days, he would have been rejected because he would have been given a physical, which he would have failed because he was underweight and malnourished. So he was never given a physical, led into the National Guard, and immediately signed on to become the 45th Division's cartoonist. He got 1 afternoon off of infantry training a week to do a cartoon. The men loved him. He was cartooning about the everyday issues of infantry training. He trained around with the 45th Division, was shipped overseas with them, was discovered by Stars and Stripes, which had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world at the time. He became the youngest Pulitzer Prize winner in history at age 23. He still is. And he came home a celebrity and a millionaire, and his life fell apart. He divorced a wife he hardly knew. He got into a vicious battle with his syndicate, his newspaper syndicate, who started censoring his post-war cartoons, changing captions, whiting out parts of his drawings, because Bill started cartooning about civil rights after the war. They didn't like that. So he quit cartooning for 10 years. He became an airplane pilot. He acted in Hollywood movies. He wrote for Hollywood. He became a political activist. He ran for Congress and lost to the cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was a Delano, a conservative Republican. He went to Korea as a correspondent, got back into cartooning, won a second Pulitzer, and kind of became the dean of American political cartoonists in the 60s and early 70s. Through it all, he fathered 8 children, 3 different wives. The last wife was younger than 3 of his children. So this guy got his oldest son today is 66, retired military. His youngest son is 23, just graduated Emerson University in Boston. And Sam, the youngest, looks just like that. Just like it. It's amazing. It's those 2 years that Mauldin spent overseas as a combat cartoonist, however, that was really the most enduring part of his legacy. Now, I mentioned when he joined the 45th Division, he signed on to become a cartoonist. The 45th Division, really an interesting division. In a segregated army, the 45th was one of the most ethnically diverse we had. It was largely a Choctaw Native American division with a lot of Mexican Americans. Bill was one of the few Anglos in his rifle company. And so many of Mauldin's cartoons dealt with Native American themes. Here's Joe in 1940. Joe barefoot, a Choctaw. Boy, it's good to be back in civilian clothes again. The men loved him, loved his stuff, because he was cartooning about everyday infantry life, the mean drill sergeants, the mud, the equipment, the long marches, things like that. And Bill expected when Pearl Harbor happened that he would become pretty much a well-known cartoonist, a famous cartoonist overnight. Because overnight, the whole culture got interested in military themes. Lil Abner went into the Army. There was a hunger for anything themed military. So Mauldin sent out his portfolio to publishers in New York, and all he got back were rejections. He didn't understand why at first, but he would later learn why. And that was because he was in the infantry, Army infantry. And Army infantry was not expected to play much of a role in World War II in the early years. The war was supposed to be won at 30,000 feet. The war was supposed to be won through long-range artillery, through mobile armored units. When we needed ground forces, we would use small groups of highly trained soldiers like Marines and Army Rangers. Army infantry was just going to be used to police up after the invasion, to do the mop-up work. Consequently, the military establishment slotted not the best and the brightest into the Army infantry, but the least educated and the least motivated. Army infantry was where you went if you were so poor you had never seen a doctor. It's where you went in the early years of the war if you didn't have shoes, It's where you went sometimes if you found yourself before a judge and the judge gave you an option. What's it going to be, son? Prison or the infantry? Mauldin cartooned about this a lot. Here's Willie with the stranger in a foxhole. Did you volunteer for this or get caught in the black market? I really searched for images of Army infantry to compare with Mauldin's. And I found that in 1942, 1944, or 1943, there really weren't any infantry images if you look through the magazines and the Bond posters. There were lots of these guys, Air Corps, the sexy branch of the military. A lot of Marines. They fill the pages of World War II magazines. A lot of paratroopers. The focus of all these are on the elite. Even naval construction battalions had John Wayne in the Fighting Seabees. He doesn't look like he's doing a lot of fighting. The Merchant Marines had Humphrey Bogart in action in the North Atlantic. Army infantry had nothing. They had no movie. They had no popular images. Mauldin said it was so hard to be in the infantry in 1943 that when they went out on a Saturday night, they were at Camp Barkley and went out to Abilene on Saturday night. He said we would flap our caps down and put on an ascot and kind of pretend that we're in the Air Corps and hope that the girls didn't notice that we didn't have the patch. And that's the gag here. These are 4 Army lieutenants. Only the one on the right is an Air Corps lieutenant. The other 3 are ground forces lieutenants who are just kind of aping the fashion of Madison Avenue. I think that Mauldin would have gone down in history as a kind of footnote in the cultural history of World War II. He would have gone down in history as a kind of a cult hero of the infantry, except for one thing, and that is that the American war plan, which was so neglectful of the need for infantry, broke down. It failed. It collapsed exactly where Mauldin landed with the 45th Division in the mountains of southern Italy. It was in the Italian campaign in the fall of 1943, that often forgotten Italian campaign, that miserable Italian campaign, that the War Department finally realized that no amount of aerial bombardment or long-range artillery was ever going to evict the Germans from that peninsula. That Europe would have to be liberated the hard way, one boot step at a time, and that we were going to need masses of infantry to do it. And so, almost immediately, the War Department has this need to promote and publicize the role of the infantry and to begin attracting people into the infantry. And they trotted out a few glamorous images of infantry life and found that nobody was buying it. Infantry had been disparaged and just degraded for so long that it was hard to accept a glamorous image of infantry. But what they found that people did respond positively to, especially infantrymen themselves, was this. Look how grungy Willie and Joe look. I've got a hangover. Does it show? This cartoon and others like it made me think about, when I was doing my research, how did Americans react to this? You don't see images like this in the media at all during World War II, You see clean-cut images. So I did a little experiment. I wanted to see, did newspapers receive complaints, the letters to the editor, when Mauldin's cartoons first started appearing in April 1944. And I did a selection of newspapers around the country, and I found they did. They did. Lots of people wrote it. They wrote it and said, who are these bums who are parading around as American servicemen? Our boys don't look like this. This is an insult to our men overseas. My son doesn't look like this. He's clean cut and gung-ho. I think it took Americans a while to learn what Mauldin was trying to teach them. I think it just like it took me a while to learn what Mauldin was trying to teach. And what he was trying to teach, I think, were some basic facts about infantry life that many of you lived through and know firsthand, but Americans on the home front had no idea about. And people like me, born years later, had no idea about. Basic facts like how dirty you are. Just, again, a few minutes ago in that conversation, the three wonderful vets who were talking, they were comparing how long they went without a bath. One said, I think we went 5 months without a bath. Americans on the home front really had no idea about what that meant. Here's Willie and Joe. Joe stands over Willie. No thanks, Willie. I'll go look for some mud that ain't been used. Americans had no idea because nobody had ever told them that when you're in combat and you have to go, you have a couple choices. You go in your foxhole or you expose yourself to deadly fire. There's a wonderful vet from the 3rd Division I met in California, and I gave this talk there, and he came up to me afterwards and said, I got shot in the ass because I left my foxhole because I had to go. He said, I've never told anybody that. Now I feel I can say that. Here's Joe crawling out of his foxhole. Wish the hell I wasn't housebroke. Mauldin was trying to teach something else to Americans that they had no idea about, and that is that only a fraction of the American army was on the front lines doing fighting. 5 to 10% of America's fighting men saw any extended combat.
1 out of 9, I think.
That would be what? 5 to 10%?
Yeah.
Okay. 1 out of 9. And yet they suffered 70% of the casualties. And that injustice is what drove Mauldin, I think, that inequity. And he cartooned a lot about it. You always get the sense in his cartoons that there are really two armies, one doing the fighting, the other not. Straighten those shoulders. How long have you been in the army? He's right, Joe. When we ain't fighting, we should act like soldiers. That can't be no combat man. He's looking for a fight. We call them Garrett troopers. They're too far forward to wear ties and too far back to get shot. guy's favorite. That sign says Division Command Post. Here comes one of them clerks from Corps. Start picking your teeth with a bayonet. There's a great story behind this one. This is Willie being cited for being out of uniform on the streets of Naples in December 1943. His defense? Them buttons were shot off when I took this town, sir. The story is, you notice that Red Cross Officers Club? Remember that? This gentleman just told me a few minutes ago that he remembers, I guess it was the Battle of Bulge. He got a few minutes off, saw a Red Cross stand, and he was hungry and freezing, and wanted a cup of coffee and a donut, and she said, that'll be 10 cents. He had something, Mauldin hated the Red Cross during the war. But here's the story. Naples was the base of American operations. In Italy, it was run by a general named Arthur Wilson. And Arthur Wilson ran a tight ship. He wanted the streets to be clean. He wanted the traffic lights to work. And he didn't want any funny business going on in the streets. And he had a little problem, and that was every once in a while, combat soldiers from the mountains came down on 4 days leave. Not many of them did, because we never had enough soldiers in those mountains. But if you had a psychotic break on the front line, you didn't know where you were, you didn't know who you were, your commander would point you down the mountain and you would go on 4 days leave. You would trudge down into Naples, and you could imagine what these guys looked like. Grizzled, torn, bloody, muddy uniforms. Deranged. The order of the day was for MPs to arrest these men for being out of uniform, put them in jail, feed them a hot meal, give them a shower, and then at the end of the 4 days, send them back up the mountain. This enraged Mauldin. So he did this cartoon. And when Arthur Wilson saw this cartoon, General Wilson saw it, he said, I want this cartoonist arrested for insubordination, and I want him placed in jail so he can't spread his subversion with his cartoons while we're awaiting the trial. Mauldin was ultimately saved. It's a complicated story, but he was saved ultimately by other generals, mainly Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was the former president's son, and who was a champion of combat soldiers. And General Roosevelt intervened and said, no, don't touch this cartoonist. He's saying what needs to be said. And as a footnote, a few months after my book came out, I got an email from a reader who said, I really enjoyed your biography of Bill Mauldin, and I thought you'd be interested to know that Arthur Wilson was my uncle. I was afraid to read what he was going to say next. And he said, I think you'd be interested to know that Uncle Arthur was no more popular in the family than he was in the army. Arthur Wilson didn't like this one either. 2 soldiers down on 4 days leave. All the clubs and taverns were off limits to anybody but members of his staff. The hell with it, sir. Let's go back to the front. It was a grim world that Mauldin depicted. And it was a world where I think soldiers realized that this is really not going to end well. When you're in the war for the duration, one of 3 things could happen. You're going to be killed, you're going to be wounded so grievously that you weren't put back in the line, or the war would end before the first 2 things happened. And I think that's the realization that Willie is making here. I'm beginning to feel like a fugitive from the law of averages. The psychological toll that combat took was astronomical. As you may know, 30% of all American casualties in Europe were psychological. It was called battle fatigue. We weren't allowed to write about it. Ernie Pyle, 3 times, the great Scripps Howard correspondent, Ernie Pyle, who discovered Mauldin, 3 times tried to write about battle fatigue, and he was censored. Americans on the home front never got to read about it. This is one of the few comments, and I think it's very indirect, but I think it's unmistakable. Here's Willie, unbandaged, in a field hospital in Italy, staring straight ahead, that 1,000-yard stare. 3 officers are standing over him, and one says, I think you should at least try to lie at attention. One of the few ways that the men had to relieve the stress was through alcohol. The problem with Americans that American soldiers had was they weren't issued alcohol with their ration. The Germans were, the British were, but the Americans weren't. So the Americans had to make it or had to acquire it some other way. And so many of his cartoons deal with this attempt to acquire alcohol. Here's Joe with a crazy homemade still and his company commander crouching over him saying, looking very disapprovingly, hell of a way to waste time. Does it work? Or this one, that German soldier, drunken German soldier walking by with a bottle of cognac. Willie and Joe say, don't startle him, Joe. It's almost full. The Germans, when they evacuated an Italian village, they would go down to the wine cellars and destroy all the wine, knowing that it would hurt American morale. The American soldiers, when they came into a village, one of the first places to go is in those cellars to get the vermouth. Them rats, them dirty, cold-blooded, sore-headed, stinking Huns, them atrocity-committing skunks. The Italians liked it when the Americans came in. They were being liberated. But the Italians were also getting this great new market for their alcohol. The Germans were very picky in what they bought. They only bought the good stuff because they got a liquor ration. The Americans would buy anything. So here's Hans and Fritz, two German soldiers, talking to each other. We must be retreating, Fritz. They're watering the vermouth. Look at this wonderfully composed drawing in a minute. This was the drawing, this was the cartoon that the Pulitzer Committee singled out in May of 1945 when they said that Mauldin deserved the Pulitzer Prize for his work. And this cartoon, among others, really made me ask a fundamental question while I was writing the book, and that is, how did this 22-year-old, 23-year-old punk get away with this stuff? How did he get away with cartoons like this one, which exposed as a lie the sanguine propaganda that Americans were getting back home about, the Americans winning every battle and the enemy cutting and running? Here's the caustic caption that accompanies this cartoon of Joe with some German POWs. Fresh, spirited American troops, flushed with victory, are bringing in thousands of hungry, ragged, battle-weary prisoners. News item. How did Mauldin get away with this? The answer lies in a document in the National Archives, written by General George Marshall in September 1943. It's a telegram that went out to all theaters of operation, one of the most important of the war, from my point of view. And in this telegram, he explains, he says, the publicity campaign that the War Department has pursued thus far has not met with our expectations. The propaganda campaign has failed. Actually, it succeeded. The campaign, showing only the positive news, has convinced 30% of the American people that the war should be winding down really soon. This is in September 1943. Americans were getting impatient with wage and price controls, with rationing, with their loved ones being overseas for months at a time. If we're winning every battle, the war should be over by Christmas 43. The War Department and the White House understood that if they raised expectations too high, somebody would pay the political cost. And that somebody was going to be President Roosevelt. So the order came down. Let's sober the American people a bit. Let's show them some of the grim realities of war. Let's teach them three things. That the enemy is lethal. That the war is going to be a long, difficult slog. And that there are some people overseas making a sacrifice greater than you are at home. And for the first time ever, images of dead Americans were permitted in the media. This is the first one ever shown. It appeared in Life magazine, September 1943. 3 dead Marines at Buna Beach, New Guinea. A lot of those who saw it will always remember it. It really signaled a change in the War Department's publicity campaign. And Bill Mauldin was a really important part of that change. He was someone who had perfect pitch. He could share the grim realities of war without stepping over the line, without stepping over into the censored arena. And that's what made him such a successful cartoonist, and that's why he was protected. In subsequent telegrams, General Marshall ordered specifically, don't touch Mauldin's work. So generals were told they weren't allowed to touch Mauldin's work. But you guys might be familiar with one general who just hated Mauldin so much he couldn't help himself. This guy. Old Blood and Guts. Have you heard of him? Patton, from what I understand, didn't have that much of a sense of humor, but he was a spit and polish general, right? You were supposed to wear your top button buttoned and your ties in your foxholes. And when he first saw Mauldin's cartoons in July 1943 in Sicily, in the 45th Division News, he didn't like it. And he went to the commander of the 45th Division, Troy Middleton, and he said, "Get rid of that cartoonist." And Middleton said, "I can't get rid of Mauldin. My men will mutiny if I get rid of him. He's the most popular guy in the division." And Patton said, "I don't care, get rid of him." And Middleton said, "Put it in writing." And Patton never got around to putting it in writing because he was soon embroiled in a controversy where he slapped a couple soldiers he accused of malingering. And Patton was extracted from Sicily and put on rest on ice for a while in London. Mauldin would then go on to be picked up by Stars and Stripes and become a celebrated kind of heroic figure in the army, and was well on his way to becoming a Pulitzer Prize winner when the two men met again. They kind of met again at the peak of their powers. Mauldin, one of the most beloved enlisted men in the United States Army. Patton, a hero for the role he played in saving the Battle of the Bulge. And they met when Mauldin decided to leave Italy and go to mainland Europe. He says that he wanted to go see the Battle of the Bulge, but he arrived too late. I think he deliberately kind of delayed his arrival. He arrived in southern France in great style, as was his kind of character. Mauldin was not like an ordinary soldier. He wore that hat a lot. That hat belonged to the 10th Mountain Division. Somebody had given it to him as a gift. A tank commander had given him a tank commander's jacket as a gift, and he wore it around as if he were a tank commander. He had sewn extra pockets in his fatigues for his art supplies. He called officers by their first names, which was the practice on the Stars and Stripes. He wore his hair longer than regulation. He probably would have grown a beard if he could. He drove his own Jeep. General Mark Clark, commander of the 5th Army, gave Mauldin a brand new Jeep for his own personal use, and this caused a problem because Jeeps weren't assigned to individuals for personal use. They were assigned only to military units, so the Army had to create a unit called Bill Mauldin. He was the driver and the passenger, and motor pool guy. And not only did he get a Jeep, but he got a stack of trip tickets that could get him through any roadblock in Europe. This Jeep was the most prized thing he ever got in his whole life. He wrote his dad, "Finally, a Mauldin owns a new car." He pimped it out with images of Willie and Joe on the side. He built a blackout shelter. He went to an Italian junkyard and found a red sports car, Lancia, pulled out the bucket seats and installed it in his Jeep. This guy was a prima donna, if there ever was one. He took it over to southern France. Battle of the Bulge is over, so he figures, I'm going to drive to Paris and have a good time. Takes his Jeep up to Paris and is arrested at a roadblock. He explains. The MP say you're a deserter, who have stolen a Jeep. He explains, no, I'm the great Bill Mauldin. And they look him in the eye and they say, we've never heard of you. He had done so many anti-MP cartoons, they were getting back at him. So they start to take him to jail. He bribes them somehow not to take him to jail, but to take him to the Paris office of Stars and Stripes. And Mauldin says, they should have taken me to jail. It would have been better. Because at the Paris office of Stars and Stripes, the officers in charge of the paper were having a meeting about his cartoons. Right when he arrived. And from Colonel Oscar Solbert on down. And they say, oh, the great Bill Mauldin, have a seat. We have a few things to discuss with you. Here's a letter from Charles de Gaulle. He doesn't like your cartoons about the French. Here's a letter from General John Lee, Quartermaster-in-Chief of Europe. He doesn't like your cartoons about the bad supply situation here. And just today we got a letter, 3 pages, single-spaced, from General George Patton, who says if we don't get rid of your cartoons, he's going to stop distributing Stars and Stripes to his 3rd Army, to the entire Army. The issue got so intense that the editors contacted Ike. Eisenhower loved Mauldin. He thought they were funny, and he thought Mauldin's cartoons were good for morale. But Ike also loved his brilliant general, and he knew that Patton had the habit of getting distracted with controversies. So to diffuse the controversy, Ike said that Mauldin and Patton should have a no-rank, face-to-face, man-to-man meeting and sort it all out. Mauldin thought this was insane. He was told he would have to take his Jeep and drive 200 miles east to the Ducal Palace of Luxembourg, where Patton had requisitioned as his headquarters. Mauldin's reply was, and this is verbatim, 200 miles is a long way to drive to get my ass chewed, sir. But the order came in, and he had to get a whole new suit of uniform, a whole new uniform, polish his helmet, polish his sidearm. He drove his Jeep to Luxembourg, was immediately arrested upon entering the Third Army. He explained very casually, I have a meeting with the general. They thought he was a lunatic, but the story checked out. And they lead Sergeant Mauldin to the throne room that Patton had requisitioned as his office. And Mauldin said he'll never forget those great oak doors opening. And across a football field's worth of Baroque carpeting was a huge desk, and behind the desk was the great general. And sitting in a chair, and you could barely see it up there, next to the desk was Patton's beloved bull terrier, Willie. He said it was like looking at father and son. The only thing Willie lacked were the ribbons and stars that the general had. Mauldin strode across the carpet, snapped his sharpest salute, and Patton snapped his fingers. Willie jumped from the chair. Bill took the chair. Bill says later that Willie growled at him the entire time. And Patton began to lecture Mauldin on the need for discipline, how insubordinate his cartoons are. You know, you can't win a war with a mob. You need discipline. And, you know, Mauldin said he was so passionate, it was inspiring to hear it. And he was actually almost enjoying it until Patton opened a desk drawer. And Mauldin looked over and saw that in that drawer was nothing but clippings of his cartoons. And that's when Mauldin said, this man's obsessed. And Patton peeled off the top one and held it by the tip of his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. And he dangled it in front of Mauldin's nose and said, what the hell are you trying to do with this cartoon except cause insubordination? Mauldin said this was a difficult one to explain. Willie and Joe parading through a French village, and they're throwing rotten tomatoes at their commanding officer. And the officer's aide says, my sir, what an enthusiastic welcome. Mauldin cringed having to explain that. The second one General Patton peeled off was this one. Had no caption. Patton said, I don't get it. Where's the caption? And Mauldin said, it's not one of my better efforts. It's a theater, and soldiers are lined up to see a show, and then the officers are lined up at the stage door with candy and flowers, and they're going to date the stage girls. Patton kind of got that one. Mauldin said Patton he brought his one corner of his mouth up parallel with the center. He said, which was an incredible muscular feat considering the distance it had to go. At the end, Patton gave Mauldin 2.5 minutes to rebut. And Mauldin trotted out an argument that he had heard officers use who liked his stuff. And he said, you know, the life up front is so hard and so short and so ill understood that anytime these guys see their grievances aired in public, it makes them feel better about their situation. It helps morale, and it prevents mutiny in the ranks. Patton dismissed the argument with a wave of the hand, stood up, saluted, and ordered Bill to go out and be a good soldier. Now, what is most remarkable about this confrontation is that this 23-year-old Sergeant Mauldin could get the better of Patton in a meeting like this. Bill was a arrogant, peppery guy. His family assures me that whenever he got in an argument with him, he always insisted on having the last word, and this is how Mauldin got the last word with Patton. First of all, he brought his friend with him to Luxembourg, a guy named Will Lang. Will Lang was the senior war correspondent for Time Life. And Will Lang was waiting in the Jeep and said, Bill, how did the meeting go with Patton? And Bill said, well, he gave his point of view, I gave mine. I don't think we changed each other's minds, but we parted good friends. And Will Lang said, "Can I quote you on that?" He said, "Sure." And when that quotation appeared in the next issue of Time magazine, that's when Patton's aide heard him exclaim, "If that little son of a bitch ever steps in my Third Army again, I'll throw his ass in jail." The second way he got back at Patton was through this cartoon, and it took me a while to figure this out. It took 4 days between the time Mauldin executed the drawing until it appeared in the European edition of Stars and Stripes. So Mauldin did this drawing on February 23rd, 1945, so that it would appear in the February 27th issue, the very day of his meeting with Patton. You could almost imagine Mauldin leaving the office, the paper being delivered to the general opening it up, seeing this cartoon, and hitting the roof. It's Willie and Joe in a Jeep, and they come across this billboard. "You are entering the Third Army. Fines. No helmet, $25. No shave, $10. No buttons, $10. No tie, $25. No shine, $12.50. No shampoo, $25. Windshields up, $25. Trousers down, $50. Enforced by order of old Blood and Guts." And Willie says to Joe, "Radio the old man will be late on account of a 1,000-mile detour. They're going to drive around Third Army so that they're not arrested." And that's the kind of man Bill Mauldin was, and that's what made him irresistible to me as the subject of a biography. Thank you very much. Do you have any comments or questions?
I've got a VE Day cartoon, Willie and Joe and the German in the other foxhole.
He said something like, "The hell with it, I'll stand
I'm
up."
not saying it, but the he does.
Yeah, till he stands up. Right, I'm not standing up till he does. That's right. The VE Day cartoon that Mauldin wanted to do, he had one cartoon censored during the war. One censored for the content. And that was his VE Day cartoon that he prepared. Willie and Joe get killed. On the last day of the war, every soldier's nightmare. And the editor said, "I won't publish it." And that was it. So he brought Willie and Joe home with him. He was in North Africa very briefly with the 45th Division. He was not in the campaign. No.
That's where Roosevelt, I think, isn't that where he found out about Bill Mauldin and liked him?
I think Roosevelt found out later about Mauldin, yeah, because Mauldin would have landed in North Africa in June 43. Yeah.
What did he do right after the war? What was his
Right after the war, his good friend Ernie Pyle, when Ernie Pyle was killed, Mauldin was terrified, even though he had 138 points. he was going, he had enough points to go home. He was terrified that he would be called essential to the war effort and sent to the Pacific. He didn't think he would live if he were sent to the Pacific. So he spent those last days trying to ensure that he was able to get out of the Army. He was a very good boy in the last few months of that war, and his cartoons don't get very controversial because he doesn't want to cause any problems. And he was demobilized, let out of the Army. He started cartooning, brought Willie and Joe home in civvies. For about a year and a half, he did Willie and Joe cartoons. They're wonderful. They're post-war problems of kind of adjusting back to life and dealing with families who didn't understand. And so he did cartoon, and then he got into this big battle with the syndicate, and he dropped out of cartooning altogether. He started doing other things.
One of his favorites post-war is Willie and Joe in civilian uniform in an elevator with the elevator operator in the hotel uniform. And the caption is, "Glad to see you back in uniform, Major."
That's a great one. Excuse me?
Your presentation's in the book.
Yes. It's kind of the presentation is kind of a capsulized version of the book. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
Oh yeah.
You know General Middleton is?
Troy Middleton,
Yeah.
45th
In
Division.
his biography, Middleton claims he played a role in keeping Mauldin away from Patton.
He did. He did. I've heard this from others. Middleton knew that Patton hated Mauldin so much in Sicily that anytime that General Patton came around the 45th Division, Middleton would warn Mauldin to go hide, go somewhere else. So he was always hiding in closets, literally, so that Patton wouldn't find him. Yes?
Troy Middleton inspected the 87th Division just before we were disbanded at Fort Benning about September of 45.
Really? Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I was part of the honor guard, and I've got a picture that appeared in the Columbus, Georgia newspaper of Middleton and Hewlin going down the line of the honor guard.
That is amazing. Middleton was a true champion. Without Middleton, Mauldin might never have happened. Middleton was an absolute champion of Mauldin's cartoons. Always was. That's really neat.
We talk about so much about the 101st Division in Bastogne.
Yes.
That was surrounded. But General Middleton said the greatest fighting began after the so-called siege of Bastogne, which included the 87th, the 11th Army, and the 17th Airborne.
Yes, from what I've read of the Battle of Bulge, it was pushing the Germans back that was the nightmare.
I can confirm that story about the Red Cross. It was 4 months for me. They sent me back for a shower afterwards in the cold. And when I came out, the Red Cross the table was there, and I asked for a donut and coffee, and I got the same answer. And I turned on my heels and turned around and said, I haven't been paid for 4 months, and walked away. Nobody came out.
That's unbelievable. I've had one really angry reaction to my book and my presentation. It was by a guy who worked for the Red Cross. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
On behalf of everybody here, I want to thank you, Todd, so much for bringing Willie and Joe up front and Bill Mauldin up close and personal. I feel like I know him. I've been looking forward to this for so long, and I know you all have too. And I hope that you have more books here.
Yes.
And are you willing to stay around?
Oh, yes, yeah. Autograph books or whatever you'd like, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And I promise this is not competition, but I want to put a plug in here in case you haven't seen these. These are at the quartermaster table. These are reproductions. I have about 20 reproductions of our resident cartoonist, Mike Petrick's work, and they're for sale for $3 a piece. So if you want something of Mike's as well, and he, as you know, he always signed it below apologies to BM, who's Bill Mauldin. So, like I said, not competition, but we'd love for you to look at these too. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Bill Mauldin, George Watson tells us that Mike Petrick is in the hospital. Right now. He's been there for a couple of days. Have you spoken to him? About a week. Right. Have you spoken to him from here?
No.
Okay. All right. So that's an update on Mike Petrick as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you.